was made by Zenon Kaluza in his book dedicated to Thomas of Krakow. And Zenon Kaluza contradicts Palemon Glorieux's theory that the author, more likely the owner and compiler of this manuscript, was Jean of Falisca. This is the group of manuscripts related to the 16,408. Out of these, only the 16,279 and the 16,425 are full copied texts. The first is a biblical concordance, so the full manuscript is like this. And the second is the Summa de Casibus of Raymond de Peñafort. All of the other manuscripts are collections of notes and short text, all intended for personal use. Alongside these manuscripts, there is another worth mentioning, a partial copy of 16,408. The manuscript Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Latin, number 16,409, which Glorieux attributed to a student of Jean of Falisca, and Kaluza proves to have belonged to Thomas of Krakow. Unlike the manuscript it is partially based on, the 16,409 uses the same paper throughout, has the same ink, and the writing is the same throughout it. The 16,409, once again, unlike the 16,408, has thematic unity, collecting texts that touch upon determinism, predestination, and free will, as Zenon Kaluza states. I'm going to come back to the main subject of the discussion, which is the 16,408, but not before quoting a more or less accepted definition of a notebook. Those who have heard me speak have certainly heard me invoke it, and arguing that from how Zenon Kaluza describes the contents of the manuscripts from Gaudet's library, one can conclude that they are all, with the exception of the mentioned 16,279 and the 16,425 notebooks. So James O'Donnell gives a definition in his article Retractions, where he says that a notebook is, and I quote, an open-ended collection created and arranged for its usefulness to the owner-author, making sense purely in terms of the owner's-author's needs. Please retain the idea that it is open-ended. Now, this is how Zenon Kaluza describes the library of Gaudet. This is too much French for me to read out loud. However, in short, he says that the numerous quires that Etienne Gaudet had collected during his studies, and even later on, formed organized books that were not bound and were called volumina. Since they were separated, these quires, and even these volumina, because they were quite small, could be easily moved from one volume to another and even be lent to others. Although this malleability has its advantages, it also has serious disadvantages, the most important being that some of the quires were lost, never getting a chance to be bound nor to reach us. And Etienne Gaudet himself mentions having lost them every now and again. This is a case, right? In the margin you can see Istut volumen fuit perditum. So this volume was lost. That's a pity for us. Kaluza states that these manuscripts stand witness to the practice that students in theology had the habit of preparing their lectures in advance by reading, taking notes, looking for positions to defend or to contradict. Now, getting back to the manuscript 16,408, which is described in great detail by Palémon-Glorieux in the article Jean de Falisca, La formation d'un maître en théologie au XIVe siècle. It is very complex, composed in different moments of many choirs, and it has many internal and external references, and just as many corrections and deleted paragraphs, sometimes even deleted pages. And here are some instances of deleted paragraphs. And even of entire deleted pages. Okay. The manuscript also has tables of contents, which were added when the choirs were bound together. And the table of contents refers to what has been before it and not what follows, since it is bound at the end of a collection of choirs. These tables of contents are edited by Glorieux in the mentioned article. And here are some instances. I would like to draw your attention to one of these tables, and it is called Table B in Glorieux's description. And I would like to further focus on what part of the manuscript that this table refers to contains. And from this specific part, mostly focus on the scholastic exercises preserved. So the first sextern is between folios, as you can see, between folios 125 recto and 130 verso, and has a text on the elements, which is crossed out, and then it is followed by exercises, disputations held at the Sorbonne in Capella, and I'll get back to that. But first, this is the text deleted. And not the fact that it is deleted is not interesting in itself. However, the reason why it was deleted is very interesting, because we find it in the lower margin of folio 125 recto. There is the explanation. So, rigantur, verlineantur, hec tria folia, so 3 folios are deleted. Non quia contenta in eis sunt inutilia, not because what is within them is useless, sed quia impertinentia theologicis inquisitionibus, but they were deleted because they did not pertain to theological inquiries. The third and the fourth choirs also have scholastic exercises from the Sorbonne, from both the Capella and the Aula. The seventh, once again, some reportaciones from scholastic acts. So, coming back to choirs 3 and 4, the scholastic exercises that they contain are specific to the Sorbonne, and they either took place in a smaller room with no public, which was called Capella, or in the Grand Hall, which was called Aula. The exercises were meant for the members of the college. They were inside exercises, and students could, from very early on, take part in them. They should not be, however, confused with the disputationes sorbonice, which were a type of disputationes vacantiales open to the public at large. The fragments at folios 141 recto, 143 verso are notes, many of them on the topic of sin. And they seem to be abbreviations from more complex discussions. Here is a list of the topics. This is followed by notes taken from a principal dispute of a certain Master Nicholas and some other notes, such as notes on the sacrament of the Eucharist. But let's take a minute and look at the list that we have in front of us. One can hypothesize that these are abbreviations of arguments. And given the tabula from 206 verso, which explicitly states the primis tuis exercitiis scolasticis, the most probable hypothesis is that these are notes taken from exercises that took place in the Collège de la Sorbonne. My theory is that they are not first order notes, that is to say that these are not the actual pieces of paper that were in the classroom, but they are copied from notes taken in class, so, they are second order notes. The main reason why I think this is the case is that there were blank spaces after some of the entries, such as in this case, which were completed with other notes later on. But this would not have been the case with notes taken live, which would have had to be continuous. Then the page itself, I think, is quite well organized and structured. So I don't think these were actually taken live. The first question from 141 recto is whether a human being could freely avoid any venial sin. The question is structured in a typical scholastic fashion, but it seems to be abbreviated. There is an argument for the negative, which will receive counter-arguments. On the same page, there are two notes, which are not directly related to the question, and the second note is clearly the result of oral teaching, or at least of oral exercises, given that it is introduced by nota duas rationes quas audivia quodam magistro. So, two reasons that I heard from some master. This is followed by the reportatio of a question discussed by a certain Master Nicholas. The language is clearly that of a report from an oral event, because it uses a lot of indirect speech and narrative speech. Like, for instance, fuit facta ratio de martirio, secundo fuit argutum contra rationem suam, contra istud fuit argutum. The subject of these notes changes quite suddenly. So from the subject of sin, it changes quite suddenly on folio 142 recto, where there is a note on hoc est corpus meum. Then at folio 143 recto, there is a reportatio from the discourse of the Dominus Cancellarius on the subject of the role of divine grace in the works that merit. This is jotted down from a disputed question because there is a mention of a respondens. And at the end of the folio, there are some mentions of other reportaciones. Some folios later, at 150 verso, one finds a question on the Eucharist, discussed by a certain Master Raimundus, which comprises 4 difficulties, the first of which regards issues of transubstantiation, the second difficulty regards the accidents which seem to have no subject, the third regards the indivisible manner in which the body of Christ presents itself, and the fourth, the fact that one and the same body is in more than one place. And these are all quite common discussions on the Eucharist. After this discussion regarding the Eucharist, at 141 recto, we find a question that was discussed in capella, ordinarie. This means that it was an exercise among the members of the college, an exercise which did not take place in the main hall, aula, but in a smaller room. Usually, the disputations which took place in aula at the Sorbonne were called sorbonice, and these were public disputations to which participated students and masters who were not members of the college nor related to it. This dispute became mandatory for the Faculty of Theology. It was organized during the summer and supervised by a prior vacantialis. So these disputationes sorbonice were a type of disputationes vacantiales, and there are many such disputations in the late 14th and in the 15th century. I personally know of some in Vienna and Cologne, and what they have in common with the Sorbonic ones is that they take place during the summer, they are mandatory for bachelors in theology, and they are directed by a prior vacantialis. Also, maybe not as important, but clearly not a coincidence, they all take place in aula, which indicates that they were directed towards a larger audience. The mentioned question in Capella asks whether a sinner can make amends by himself for the mortal sin. The general idea of the question is to see how much grace and how much will are needed in order for somebody to be absolved from sin or to do sufficient amount of penance for a certain sin. The question has the shape of a report from an oral discussion. It has formulations such as posuit tres conclusiones, contra hoc codicebat, solutiones fuerunt, so somebody is talking about what happened. The reportator also makes some judgments of value. So he says things like solutiones fuerunt, alique placerent, considera bonas rationes factas, in secunda responsione plura bona dicta fuerunt. This is coherent with the rules put forward by the very founder of the college, Robert de Sorbonne. So his rules are as follows. The first is to go to class, the second to study what is taught, the third to commit to memory the important aspects, the fourth is to write down what is discussed, more exactly what one has learned, not only what was discussed. The fifth is to dispute, and the sixth, of course, to pray. So the commandment to commit to writing what one has learned is probably what motivated this abbreviated report from oral events. The practice of disputing in Capella itself is the result of the fifth commandment, confere cum aliis in disputationibus. This practice was important for the members of the college, and they even had the rotulus containing the titles of the questions to be discussed each year. So this question discussed in Capella is followed by different types of notes. And I would like to conclude because my time is running up. This part of the manuscript, whose contents are enumerated in the tabula that mentions the primis tuis exercitiis scolasticis, represents a witness to the practices which were customary in college for the members of the Collège de la Sorbonne. But it also testifies to the interests of the individual who gathered it, given that there are clear signs of abbreviation alongside judgments of value. So just to summarize, there are numerous notes in this part of the manuscript. This was just a very short presentation of some of the discussions that can be found in quires 3 and 4 from the second part of the manuscript, Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Latin number 16408. Thank you.